Chapter 7 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton Dean. Chapter 7, 1890 to 97, Lethbridge. No history of the great lone land in these latter days would be complete without some mention of the late Lieutenant Colonel James Farquharson Macleod, C.M.G. He first went west with the Wolseley expedition of 1870, and subsequently succeeded Sir George French as Commissioner of the Mounted Police. Later, when Lieutenant Colonel A.G. Irvine was appointed Commissioner, Colonel Macleod became Stipendiary Magistrate for the North West Territories. His headquarters at first were at Pincher Creek, where he had a nice place, of which he was very proud. He was also very proud of his charming wife and family, most of it daughters, who, I believe, are all well and happily married. After this stipendiary magistrate blossomed into the Supreme Court dignitary, Colonel Macleod went to live in Macleod. From there he would come down upon us when Lethbridge wanted a jail delivery, or when there was anything special to try, and on such occasions he would cover the 32 miles of road either by means of a convenient police team, or he would mount the box of the tri-weekly stagecoach, take the reins from Polly, the stage driver, his name being Pullinger, an old-timer, and drive the 4 horses himself. We used to have to hold court in any convenient place in those days. Sometimes, for the convenience possibly of witnesses, etc., it might be held in a room at the hotel, but generally in the barracks. After a time the Coal Company built a very prestigious building, the lower part of which was designed as a theatre, with stage, proscenium, drop curtain, etc., while the second story was divided up into rooms, which could be, and sometimes were, rented. The lower story came in conveniently, too, for concerts, dances and political meetings. I opened this theatre, by the same token, with a play which I got up for the purpose. When court was to be held, I always used to call at the hotel with my carriage for the judge. When I first congratulated him on being able to sign himself J.S.C., Judge Supreme Court, he said, "For God's sake, Dean, don't call me Judge." "All right, Colonel," I replied, and so it was ever after. I used to call for the Colonel at the hotel and drive him to the court room. I always carried with me a little pigskin bag which he christened Amicus Curiae, which contained a small glass, a corkscrew, a bottle of soda water, and little wee drop of the cratur, a pouch of tobacco, my own pipe, and some matches. We knew that the place to which we were going was desolate, and that we must provide our own creature comforts. The judge sat on the stage. The barrister's table was just across the footlights in the pit. The dock and the escort were a little beyond, and the court had a comprehensive view of all that went on within the limits of its vision. I used to do all the J.P. work of the place, and I remember being told of a remark made by one woman whose evidence was necessary in a certain case if she would consent to it. There was the rub. A summons would have been no use. She would, in the witness box, have been more dumb than the traditional oyster. So it was delicately intimated to her that Captain Dean would be very sorry if she would not help him to get at the bottom of the business. She retorted, "I've never been in a police court in me life, but I would have lief go up to thim barracks in front of Captain Dean and tell him what I know as I'd go to me church." So that difficulty was overcome. Colonel Macleod always insisted on my sitting beside him. "Don't you hate a conscientious witness?" he whispered to me one day after we had been bored to death for the best part of the morning by an eminently respectable citizen who would go into minute particulars and would prayerfully submit to correction at the hands of cross-examining counsel. "How would a smoke go?" "Just the thing we want to sustain us both, Colonel," I replied, and this was his dictum: "Gentlemen, the court adjourns for 10 minutes," and we slid off behind the wings to try and forget our boredom. It was my good fortune once to uphold my conviction in the Court of Appeal, a case dealing in illicit whisky. After hearing the arguments pro and con, the judge decided not to quash my conviction, and in furtherance of his decision rose from his seat and beckoned me towards the wings. "What shall we give this fellow?" he said. I replied, "Well, Colonel, as you have upheld my conviction, I have not much more interest in the matter. If you think proper to let him go on a suspended sentence, you'll not hear a whimper from me." "All right," said the judge, "we'll settle it that way, and then we'll have a smoke, eh?" The appellant in this case, Pete S., never appeared before me again. He went to the Yukon at the outbreak of the gold rush, and was killed in a brawl there. Colonel Macleod had grown up with the country, did substantial justice in his decisions, and was an exceptionally good man for the job. If he had had a crooked streak in him he could have made lots of money, but he had neither a crooked nor a mean streak, and that was why he was generally held in favour. He had the most extraordinary capacity for whisky, and was never known to show any effects of it. An amusing story is told about his going on one occasion to Fort Assiniboine on some business or another. This was an American military post in Montana, a few miles across the international boundary line, where there were usually stationed a squadron or so of cavalry and some companies of infantry. The American officers had heard of the Colonel's reputation and of his capacity, and determined to make a comprehensive test of the latter. It was even said that they had one or two relays of officers who were to keep their guest company until he was finally disposed of. As the evening wore on, and the bottle circulated freely, man after man disappeared, either under the table or into an armchair or some other seclusion, and when Colonel Macleod assisted the one solitary survivor up the stairs to his bed, the latter stopped short on the first landing and said, "By God, Colonel, where did you put it?" We had a little piece of excitement now and again. One was when it was reported that coal oil had been found in the Kootenay country, and a miniature boom started. It was kept as much a secret as possible, but there were comparatively few people in the country then, and it was a long way to go. I had a capacious 4-horse wagon which would comfortably hold half a dozen men and their equipment, and a party of us, which included a surveyor, drove for 2 long days, 75 or 80 miles, to the scene of the action. We duly located our respective claims, paid the Dominion Lands Office the fees due thereupon, and engaged a man who had the tools to go out and drill holes. He had everything comfortably settled, derrick erected and ready for operation, when the structure took fire, and as he had no means of coping with a violent blaze, bang went our scheme, and we were out the fees that we had paid. It was in this neighbourhood that there dwelt in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains an old fellow who chose to live the life of a hermit. He had cattle on the range and was well enough to do. He used to employ an ex-mounted policeman to gather his cattle and to attend the spring round up for him, so that the calves might be branded, etc., and in the autumn the hired man would cut out any beef cattle that might be fit for the market, but otherwise the old chap lived alone. Somebody put it to him one day, "I don't see what you do and how you put in the time during the long winter months when there is no occupation for you out of doors. What do you do?" "Oh, well," said the hermit, "sometimes I sets and thinks, and sometimes I just sets." A mining craze struck southern Alberta not long after. Pioneers in a new country must have faith or they are no good. We had faith, and we backed our faith with good dollar bills, which we had far better have kept in our pockets. A banker calculated that a sum of at least $100,000 had been withdrawn from circulation in Macleod and Lethbridge. Superintendent Sam Steele, who was then in command of the Mounted Police at Macleod, was the mainspring of the movement, and that was a guarantee that the conduct of the business was at least honest. My friend Dr. Mewburn and I, and a mutual friend, invested $1,000 between us in this venture, but with no result. The next speculation I went into was the Dundee mine at Ymir in British Columbia. This was a gold mine, and, unless the reports were all falsified, a good investment. I bought 100 shares of $1 par value at 30 cents per share, and never had any sort of run for my money. I was by no means the only investor in Lethbridge, many of whose prominent citizens put their money into it. The local manager of the Bank of Montreal was one, the manager of the coal company was another, and so on. The bank manager said to me one day, "By such a date I expect to see those shares selling in the market for 50 cents." The shares did not advance in value, but the directorate at last wondered why no profits were accruing and called in an expert. He pointed out a large dump which had been dug out of the bowels of the earth and said, "Gentlemen, your profits are there. The wind is blowing them away." Think of it! The management knew no more about managing a gold mine than they knew about making boots, and even that was not the worst of it. The directors quarrelled amongst themselves, and matters went from bad to worse. Finally, without the knowledge or consent of the shareholders, they borrowed $20,000 from some British Columbia bank. God knows what became of the money, and when the money was not repaid, the bank took the mine. Readers who have had the patience to follow me through these details will admit that my experience in oil wells and mines had been unfortunate, and will wonder that when an oil boom broke out in the Calgary neighbourhood in the year 1913 I resolutely refused to have anything to do with it. There was in 1913 and 1914 a wild craze amongst all classes for speculating in oil. I do know this, though, that in spite of all my preaching, the devil whispered to me that, if there were anything worth buying in the entire outfit, it was the Dome Company's shares. The heart of man, besides being desperately wicked, dearly loves a gamble, and I reasoned with myself that $100 would neither make nor break me, and for the sake of a flutter I bought 100 shares at 90 cents apiece. They were of the par value of $1. They went gradually down until, about a fortnight after I had bought them, I found them quoted at 15, 16 and 17 cents. I had had by that time so much domestic affliction that I was glad to find something that amused me, and I stood opposite a bulletin board and laughed until the passers-by came to see what I was laughing at. From that moment I forgot all about the Dome Oil Company until after I had arrived in England, when a marked Calgary paper reached me giving an account of a judicial proceeding from which it appeared that the Dome Oil Company had been sued in the Supreme Court for breach of contract, and had been ordered to pay $250 and costs. A fool and his money, etc. Early in January 1898 Superintendent Steele was sent to the Yukon from Macleod, and I was ordered to take over his command and run it in conjunction with my own. This meant that I had a lateral front of about 600 miles to police. The Canadian Pacific were then building a line through the Crow's Nest Pass into British Columbia, and the Mounted Police had been placed in police charge of the line under construction, from the eastern boundary of the province of British Columbia as far as Kootenay Landing. This was 400 miles. In order to familiarise myself with the British Columbia locale, etc., it was obviously necessary that I should go and see for myself. I therefore drove along what was called the Tote Road for about 200 miles in March 1898, and as construction had not then begun beyond Cranbrook, it seemed to me that I had better get home and attend to business. Mr. Assistant Commissioner McIlree had been sent to Macleod to take my place while I was away. It was quite a change from our windswept prairies to drive into the British Columbian forest. The Tote Road was just a passage cleared of trees, etc., to admit of the passage of wagons, etc., hauling supplies for the various contractors' camps, and was pretty rough going. Amidst all the wealth of trees there was not a single twitter of a bird. The only live creatures to interest one were innumerable little black squirrels. We had outposts of Mounted Police dotted at convenient intervals along the line of construction, and I had fortunately a capable officer to supervise them. He went to South Africa with the Mounted Police contingent at the time of the Boer War, and returned as Lieutenant Colonel G. E. Sanders, D.S.O. He is now police magistrate at Calgary under the provincial government, having retired on pension from the Dominion Force. Our redcoats carried as much weight in British Columbia as they had done since the opening up of the western prairies, and our troubles were only of an ephemeral nature. I used to spend 4 days out of each week at Macleod, and 3 at my house at Lethbridge. I had at my disposal a 4-horse team at each place, which were not diverted from my personal purposes, and as a rule, at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, I stepped into my wagon at Lethbridge and the team started. The routine was the same, winter or summer, except that in winter, when a sufficient snow was on the ground, the vehicle was a sleigh. The distance to Macleod was 32 miles, and at about the 13th milestone the Old Man's River crossed the road. There, on the far side, was a small police reserve, with appropriate buildings, wherein a small detachment of 2 or 3 men and horses were accommodated. This was an appendage of the Macleod district, and it frequently happened that it meant a saving of horseflesh to have a Macleod team there waiting for me. There were times and seasons when it was not possible for a team to ford the river, and occasionally, when the stream was in flood, or when slush ice was running down, I had to cross to the opposite bank by means of a flat-bottomed boat. When the river was frozen over, the crossing was of course easy, and then one was often glad of a 20-minute interlude at Kipp to thaw out and warm up with a cup of hot tea. My pet team belonged to Lethbridge, and consisted of 4 good trotting horses that were a delight to the eye. 2 of them had been sired by a well-known trotting horse named Combination, and they had all been bought from what was known as the Frank Strong Ranch, situated near Kipp. They were driven by a half-breed named Harry Taylor, whose father was an old-time white man who owned the Macleod Hotel, and his mother was an Indian woman. Old Taylor had done his duty by his son, for he had sent him to an excellent school at Port Hope in Ontario, and young Harry had had a capital education. He was employed by us as an interpreter, but as his services in that respect were not very much in demand, he was given charge of the team I speak of. I first found what his capabilities were in that line when he drove me along the Tote Road in British Columbia. One instance will suffice to exemplify his capacity as a whip. In 1898, Sir Roderick Cameron, a wealthy New Yorker, who had some years previously bought and fenced a township of land 36 square miles on the Bow River within the confines of the Lethbridge district, asked me if I could give him a passage to Macleod. I was only too glad to have his company, and I had arranged to take my team right through from Lethbridge. The team was not in its normal self on that day, for the off-wheeler had been found to be a little off colour, and Harry Taylor, in conjunction with the sergeant major, had chosen another horse to take its place. This substitute was a bright chestnut, a good, capable horse, well able to hold its own, but hot-headed, like a good many of his colour. He had, too, a habit of swishing his tail about, which was rather annoying. However, we had got to within about a mile of Kipp, and made good time so far, when this brute of a horse swished his tail over the rein and would not part with it. Our wagons, I should explain, were not built like English vehicles, from the box seat of which the driver looks down upon his horses. Harry Taylor's seat was very little above the level of the horses' backs, and in such a case the driver was at a very considerable disadvantage. The fact that the horse was able to gather the rein under his tail shows this. Taylor made several attempts to free the rein without success, and the chestnut began at last to plunge and kick. This very unusual disturbance communicated itself to the other horses, who had not been accustomed to this kind of thing, and they started off on the dead run. They swept off the beaten trail, and, being beyond Taylor's control, headed for a point about a quarter of a mile distant, where the current of the Old Man had washed out what is known as a cut bank, an almost perpendicular precipice cut out of the bank by the stream. Sir Roderick Cameron was a horseman, and had no lack of nerve, but I realised that he was over 70 years of age. the old gentleman said, "They're off." Instead of replying, I moved up to the front seat and said to Taylor, "Give me the leaders or the wheelers, whichever you think best." "Wait a minute, sir," said he, "I'll have one try." And with that he slackened up all the reins and shouted to his horses, "Whoa!" There was no more surprised man in southern Alberta that day than Sir Roderick Cameron, K.T., when the maddened horses heard their master's voice and "whoaed," came to a standstill, and allowed me to jump out and free the rein from the chestnut's tail. I have seen runaways. I was in one only myself, but I have never saw such a triumph of mind over matter as I saw on the occasion just described. If the horses had not known the man, and had not answered his call as they did, it might have been kingdom come for some of us. We continued our journey as if nothing had happened, and arrived at Macleod in due time. There was nothing in the demeanour of my septuagenarian companion to denote that his pulse had quickened, but mine had on his account, although I treated the matter as a common incident of prairie life. CHAPTER 8.